Everyone, we are back again with a new chapter on the Italian Renaissance. Today we're going to take a look at characteristics of the Renaissance, and this is sort of like two slideshows in one because we are going to talk about humanism as well. So getting things started, Marco Polo was a merchant from the city of Venice. In the 1270s, he went to China to meet with Kublai Khan, and he wrote a book about his experience. And Europeans became fascinated with Asia. Most Europeans had never been to Asia, so he's writing about the foods, the animals, the culture, just all of this stuff that he's experiencing. And this is like a whole new world to these Europeans. So they become completely fascinated by this. There are some conspiracy theories out there on Marco Polo, which are really, really interesting if you're into that kind of thing. But this is the reason that Marco Polo is famous. Florence will be the most famous city of the Italian Renaissance. They were also the first to grow wealthy. They were known for their artists, and the city was enclosed by a wall, and it also had towers for defense purposes. People in Florence were known for their love of elegant clothing. Their wealth came from trading cloth and wool. The merchants would travel to England to get the wool, and then their artisans would create fine fabrics out of it. People in Florence, though, are going to find a new way to make money, and it's going to be through banking. Goods from all over Italy were coming into Florence, and merchants needed to know the value of different coins. So each country, territory, area at this time is going to have their own money. So there's, at this point in history, no way to compare these in terms of the value of these particular coins or currencies. So the bankers in Florence are going to become the experts on this. They're going to use the florin to measure the value of other money. The florin was the gold coin of Florence. So today, obviously, we don't have one currency throughout the world. There's a bunch of different currencies, but the US dollar is going to be what is used to measure the value. So, for example, a peso in Mexico has a lot less value than the US dollar. But then you have something like the euro in recent years that has actually had more value than the US dollar. But the US dollar is just sort of the standard that everything is based off of. Bankers would begin lending money and charging interest. This is how banks make money. Banks don't just hand out money for free. They have to get something in return. So, for example, if you took out a $100 loan with a 20% interest rate, you now owe the bank $120. So the bank would make $20 off of you. Is that a realistic example? No, it was an easy example. A common one, let's say you take out a $200,000 loan because you're buying a house. If it's a 5% interest rate, which is sort of standard, that means that by the time you pay for your house, you're going to owe the bank an extra $10,000. So even though the loan is for $200,000, you owe the bank then $210,000. The Medici family were the largest bankers. They had branches as far away as London, and they not only controlled the money, but they're going to also eventually control Florence itself. Venice is going to be the wealthiest city-state in all of Italy. They had great sailors and were great at building ships. They built the city on small swampy islands, so they learned to drive long wooden columns, almost like a big telephone pole, into the ground in order to support the buildings. So when you look at this picture here, all of these buildings are actually on stilts almost that are driven down into the water. Instead of paving roads, which it is possible to pave a road over top of like a marsh or some water, they decided it would just be easier to cut canals through the town instead. So gondolas would be one of the major sources of transportation. A gondola is the boat that you see in the picture on this slide. And much of Venice's wealth is going to come from making ships. They're going to build these ships at the Arsenal, which was a shipyard, which was basically a place where you would make ships, and it was also sort of like a marina. They would work in teams to be the most efficient. It was kind of an early version of the assembly line, and they could build 100 ships in just 2 months' time. At first, many of the city-states in Italy were republics. If we think back, we already talked about a republic all the way back in our chapter on ancient Rome. Many city-states were run by one powerful man, and in Venice, that leader was called a doge. The Medici family ran Florence, and Lorenzo Medici is going to use his wealth to support artists, architects, and writers. Moving on to the topic of humanism. Humanism is the belief that individuals and human society are important. Humanists wanted a balance between faith and reason. So they were still religious. The church was still important, but they also didn't want to just devote their entire life to the church. They are going to encourage people to achieve great things. In the 1300s, Italians began to study early Roman and Greek works. The Italians knew very little of these. So even though they were living in Italy and all of these works were from Italy, they really didn't know anything about it during the Middle Ages. But the Muslims had kept these works, and they exposed Europe to them during the Crusades. So even though the Crusades were overall kind of a waste because nothing really changed as a result of the Crusades and all those people died, one of the positive things that came from the Crusades was the sharing of information between the two groups. The Italians are going to search churches and monasteries all over Europe in search of ancient works. Then they built libraries to house these works. The largest of those was the Vatican Library in Rome. They're going to study more than just books, though. They're going to study the buildings and the statues that are all around them. And they're going to begin to clean up the city and try to restore it to its original beauty. So they begin to appreciate what is around them, and they're starting to see that some of the things that they were maybe taking for granted before are actually true pieces of art. Educated people wrote in pure Latin. Remember, Latin was used in ancient Rome as well. Poems and other works are going to be written in vernacular, though. Vernacular would be the everyday language of a particular region. The best comparison I can make for this one, if you're writing some type of paper for Mrs. Van Tynen or Mrs. Wolford, for example, you're going to be a little bit more proper in the way that you speak. However, if you are sending a text to your friend, you're probably not going to be so proper. So that text is going to be vernacular because that's the everyday language that you would use. This is going to allow many more people to be able to read some of these ancient works. In the early 1450s, Johannes Gutenberg is going to create the printing press. This is going to produce books much faster, which means that more people will learn how to read because there's just way more books throughout Europe at that time. Scholars could read and compare works because they had more access to it, and that meant ideas could spread faster than ever before throughout Europe and Asia. The Chinese had actually invented something similar before this. It was called movable type, but it really didn't work well with a large alphabet. The Chinese alphabet's not nearly as big. So it just was challenging to use this movable type when you were using some of the languages from Europe at that time period. Gutenberg's Bible is going to be the first book produced on the printing press. About 40,000 books were produced in the first 50 years, and half of those books were religious texts. People wanted to increase their knowledge of all kinds of topics, whether it was plants, animals, anatomy, medicine, astronomy. And Leonardo da Vinci, who we're going to talk about quite a bit in this chapter, was known as a Renaissance man. Being a Renaissance man basically meant that he was good at everything. Most of us probably know someone or have someone that we kind of secretly hate a little bit, even if it's one of your friends, because they're just so good at everything. Maybe they get straight A's. Maybe they are like a great singer. They're great at sports. Basically, everything they do, they're just awesome at. I know people like that, and it's super frustrating, so I'm sure all of you do too. But that basically is what Leonardo da Vinci was like. Everything that he did, he was good at it. In his spare time, Da Vinci dissected corpses to learn about anatomy. Who doesn't do that? Studied fossils to understand history, and he was also an inventor and an engineer. Most of what we know comes from Da Vinci's notebooks. Many of his drawings depicted objects that were not invented until centuries after his death. And again, we'll talk about Da Vinci a little bit more in depth as we go throughout this chapter. But that is the end of the slides for characteristics of the Italian Renaissance and humanism.